So intellectual property can be a sleeper sometimes, but believe me, without it, I don't think many of us would be in this room because it's really hard to commercialize things that are just in the public domain. So I wonder if I can start maybe with you, Mark. And you've helped to found a lot of companies and done lots and lots of things on the innovative side. I've, in the last couple of years, watched you at Ophthalmica and at Oculeave. So tell us a little bit about each of those companies and their technology, and then tell us how and when should a young doctor or inventor go about protecting his inventions?
Great. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. And I'll tell you about my perspective as an academic and as an inventor. I think that IP is really one of the fundamental cornerstones of getting your ideas commercialized if they're good ideas. I would just say that everyone should be prepared to go through a long process with this. But I think everything needs to be reduced to practice. And so just having the idea is one thing, and writing the claims and getting it filed and then prosecuted is another. You know, I think 2 years ago, Casey, with the change from first to invent to first to file, a lot of things changed. I think people would have ideas, they'd write them in a notebook, they might not act on them for 2 or 3 years, and then when they would finally get the time, they do it, or they might read in the paper about somebody who came up with something that was fundamentally similar or not even as good, and they could show up, make a filing, prove that there was an entry in their lab notebook, and try to claim credit. Well, that's no longer the case anywhere in the world now, and so I think the key thing is to get it on paper and put in your initial application. I think the other thing is to recognize that there are some things that are a lot easier to prosecute than others. Certainly in the software world or the mobile health space, or certainly for method claims, those are tough when it's a new composition of matter. And so forth. I think that's different. But I think the key thing is to get it done, because it's going to be on the checkbox for everyone that you want to fund your company, and it's going to be on the checkbox for everyone that you want to sell your company to. That's
great. Reza, I want to turn to you, if I can. You're an inventor, you're an engineer, you were a CEO, now you're in the venture business. I mean, you've had a very expansive career in innovation. But let's just go back to the very beginning of things. What exactly is the process that a company or an inventor has to go through in order to get a license from a university? And when should he approach the university? What's the right time?
I want to continue on what was said before. I think when an inventor comes up with an idea, it's very important to think through the entire process, because products are not just a device. One has to think throughout the whole procedure. Sometimes the best patents are method patents, and that's why it's very important to understand the whole. Sometimes the packaging could be the gating item. And then it's important that before one runs to file a patent, understand the patent strategy. You know, a lot of people think of a patent as a shield. They think they have a patent, they are protected. I mean, it's always good to think of patent as a sword. You go after other people with it. It's not protection. Thinking that way, it's very important to have a strategy. And then also think, is this a product or is it a company? Do you want to go and spend a lot of money, file a number of patents around this, or you just want to file a patent and license it to? It's very important to think of this upfront. The companies I was involved, all the companies that either I founded or we never licensed from university, but I have been involved in licensing from university. I think question is more how to license from university. I mean, you should go after a patent whenever you think there's an opportunity. Sometimes I have been successful licensing from universities, sometimes I have not been. One of the challenges is because the individuals who have ideas at universities, you would like them to be involved with the product. So the contracts are more complex, especially with the individuals who are involved in the university, because you want to continue working with them to improve on the patent. And then universities have contracts with their employees. That is the part which is more difficult. But when your question was when you should go, I think you should go as soon as you find the opportunity. But it's very important that all those agreements are put in place so that when you are in your Series B or C, suddenly you realize this individual still should assign his ideas to university. So you want to make sure all of those are done upfront.
Yeah, absolutely. And be very straight, because the truth will come out. That's my experience. Well, John, you've been an inventor. In fact, I guess you've got something like 30 patents at Vizex in a prior life before you actually went back and became a patent attorney. And so after you've landed a new client in the ophthalmic space, what do you need to accomplish before that company that's been formed can really close a significant financing? What do we need to do and get in place?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. And Casey, as you noted, previously I was an engineer and inventor at Vizex and developed laser systems and that treated millions of eyes, and then later became a patent attorney and actually worked on some of those inventions. And it's been a very rewarding career that way. And with respect to a new client, especially one that's an early stage, there are a few things we would look at. One of them is freedom to operate. To a new entrepreneur who hasn't been through the process before, it's a little bit counterintuitive. An inventor might think, hey, I have this great idea, I have a patent, I can go out and do this. And it turns out that's not really the case. There could be other patents out there that are blocking patents that could keep the inventor from actually practicing things. So one of the things we would look at is the patent landscape, see what patents are out there that might be problematic, and do a fairly careful review that way. Sometimes the inventors are very savvy. They can actually do a lot of this searching themselves and identify what might be a problematic patent or potentially something that could be licensed in. Early in the stages of a business, oftentimes things can be licensed fairly inexpensively. Later on in the process, it can become quite challenging. Another aspect to look at is the patentability itself. In many instances, an inventor will have an idea, and it's important to look at the scope of the invention, get an understanding of what's been done before, and also significantly what the business goal is, what the inventor is trying to do. Make sure that the invention really is aligned with the business that the inventor is after, and also look at gaps. Are there any gaps in where a competitor might move in with design arounds? That's an important piece to look at as well in trying to close those gaps. And then another thing I would point out, as was mentioned earlier, we are under first to file now, and that's a big change for the U.S. We used to be under first to invent, and now it's a situation where someone can think of something later and file first, and if they do that and they didn't derive the invention from someone else, they're in great shape. So it's very important for a new company to be filing their patents early, and that's a very important piece. Ownership is another one too. As was pointed out earlier, sometimes people who start companies or are involved with them can have relationships outside of the new company, and those can cloud ownership later on. So it's very important to get an understanding of that, and sometimes there are things that can be done in the earlier stages, notifying an employer, for example, if their employment agreement allows outside activity, and also having all the right agreements in place, making sure all the people who are involved with the company have obligations to assign and that there aren't consultants out there with no obligation. And also another thing that would be looked at are license agreements. If there are any license agreements, is there a compliance with these, and is the license in good standing? And those would be my suggestions for what I would do with a new client starting out.
Well, I hope you guys got all that written down, because that was quite a list. Well, I want to turn to you now, Richard, if I can. You've been an inventor, a founder, a KOL, and director, I'm sure, of more companies than I can count. And when I think back, I was just hoping you could comment a little bit on the importance of patents when in evaluating market opportunities. I think about somebody like yourself who sees so many interesting products, and I just wonder how the whole IP thing relates to that in your mind.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say that having appropriate intellectual property and freedom to operate is necessary in building a company, but it's not sufficient, meaning that it's a very important first step, but if you go through the whole innovation cycle, it's only one of many steps. But the problem is that if you don't have some type of a moat like IP, you won't be able to raise any money, so you'll never get, off of ground zero. And in the end, if you want to sell your technology to someone, again, you won't be able to sell it unless you have the IP. So it's absolutely necessary, should be thought of initially. And perhaps just as a little guidance, those of us that are trying to do this on our own, we have limited resources. And I found that, just getting patents properly applied for in the U.S. Is probably enough for the individual inventor. And it's daunting enough to do that. I found personally I have had to go out to Washington and get face-to-face with the examiners to get most of my patents allowed. It's not good enough just to sit at home. You actually have to be engaged with your patent attorney and actually often go and talk to the examiner. But if you get protection in the U.S., to try to get protection in 50 countries, for example, for an individual entrepreneur is probably not possible.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about intellectual property is the process of getting these patents and protecting yourself in various countries can be unbelievably expensive. Well, I want to turn back to you if I can, Reza. As an investor now, what do you want to have in place at a company before you make an investment? And have you had any IP problems ever impact your decision to fund a company?
So the process is at the early stage, you talk to the management team, you ask their opinion, how they have filed their patent, who are their attorneys, and as you advance in the process, you engage an outside firm to do a deep dive due diligence. What is more important? Depends what stage of the company. If it's a Series A company or a Series E company, if it's an earlier stage company, freedom to operate is more important. A lot of companies have filed patent. So where I think I would advise is entrepreneurs do a good job of understanding what the landscape is. Where you don't want to happen is during due diligence, you identify prior art that the company had not, they cannot know everything, but I think it's important that they do a very thorough job of due diligence and identify some of those key patents they think may be an issue and have an answer for that. So, as I said, if it's Series A company, freedom to operate is more important. A Series E, number of patents they have filed, what is their patent strategy. So that's how it's.
Terrific. I can see where your thinking is going there. Well, John, I wanted to turn back to you if I could. When a company's being sold, what's the typical process involved in getting the acquiring company comfortable with the target's IP? Do the IP issues ever torpedo a deal, and what are some of the issues that come up in this process?
Sure, and the issues that come up are really the issues we've been talking about. Freedom to operate, patentability, can a competitor be excluded, ownership, international protection can come up. If a company only has U.S. protection, that could potentially be an issue. And a lot of what's done with working with opposing counsel is to walk them through whatever's been done with respect to freedom to operate. Has the company been keeping track of the patents that it's seen? If there are ones that look like they might be an issue, do they have a response for that? Also on the patentability side, are there any issued patents? If things have been going on for several years and nothing's happened, that can potentially be an issue. There are now provisions under the new patent law for filing fast-track cases where patents often issue within a year, and we've had very good results with that. So that's another avenue that could come up with respect to patentability. And the other thing I'd like to note is if it's a high-stakes acquisition, what can happen is the opposing side, the opposing counsel, can be incentivized by the potential acquirer to look very hard for any loose end, any hook they can go after as a bargaining point in negotiation. And if they find something, they'll use it, and they'll use it to usually not torpedo the deal, but very often to drop the price significantly. And examples that can come up would be ownership. If there's been litigation going on, problematic patents, those are all things that could come up as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks an awful lot. Mark, if I can turn to you. You were on the board at Ophthalmic and at Oculeave when those companies were sold. Do you have a sense of how important IP was to the acquirers in those companies, and how would you recommend a company prepare for that kind of IP due diligence on sale?
Sure. Well, of course, you never really know in the middle of a negotiation. What you hear is critically important, and then, of course, it may be nothing more than a bargaining chip for a haircut at the end, and there's always uncertainty. I'd say there are a couple of things that come up. I mean, one classic example, I won't cite Ophthalmic or Oculive, but was the Roche. For those of you that follow U.S. patent law, Stanford actually produced a diagnostic kit for HIV, and they licensed it, and then it turned out that another company, Roche, felt that they actually owned that, and it turned out that a Stanford professor who'd written all the IP that Stanford then licensed had signed an agreement, consulting agreement, many years earlier, which essentially transferred his potential future rights of the ownership of that technology. So this went to the federal district court, and then it went to the Supreme Court, and it was one of the most classic decisions, I suppose, that really has affected patent, certainly the application of this, which is the fact that Stanford lost this. And as a result, all of us who were on the faculty got a letter from Stanford asking us to sign new assignment documents. But I think part of it is who really owns it. I mean, it can say on paper that Stanford University or MIT or Purdue or wherever owns a patent, but actually finding out who owns it may turn out to require a court case where it turns out there were other agreements that are not known, that don't surface. So I think people are doing deeper and deeper diligence dives in light of that Roche agreement to really figure out not who owns the patent on paper, but who really owns it. And then the other issue I would bring up is the issue of, most technology today is so complicated, whether it's a biopharmaceutical, and you've got not only do you have the composition of matter, but you have the method of manufacture, and then you have the way of assay, and so forth and so on. At the end of the day, you may have 4, 5, 6, or 10 relevant patents. I mean, everything boils down in the industry to the Cohen-Boyer patent, which was the single largest source of royalty revenue to Stanford University for around 14 years, and UCSF as well. So I think when you think about patents, you actually also have to think about the business model after you own it, even assuming that there is freedom to operate, which is what's the royalty stack? Because every patent typically carries a royalty associated with it, and then when you start figuring out profit margins and discounted cash flow and so forth and so on, those things become important. So I think they're all interrelated, but I think at the end of the day, I don't know in this day and age if patents are as important to the operation of the business as they are to the selling of the business or the starting of the business. My sense is that people don't seem to have the same appetite for gladiatorial combat recently that I've certainly seen from my own experience. But I think if you don't have it, it's very painful, and if you have it, it may help you. But certainly you can't do it. I would say that in those instances that you mentioned, certainly Ophthalmica and Oculive, I'm quite confident those sales would not have occurred if there wasn't a high level of comfort that the position was good, both in terms of keeping people out and also having the freedom to operate.
Yeah. And
so if I may, I think one thing which is important to build a good portfolio when you build your patent portfolio 2 times is to have somebody in-house who continuously improves, because sometimes your better patents are yet to come. And in-house, either it is VP of R&D or inside patent, you need to have an inside champion who constantly watches what was invented. Sometimes people ignore ideas that either physicians have or engineers have or somebody in the organization in manufacturing, and you need to have someone in-house to gather that continuously.
Yeah, and that's one of the pieces that makes medical devices so different than the pharmaceutical industry, because the products are continuously evolving and being improved, et cetera. And so there are future opportunities, of course, to have inventions, et cetera, that need to be covered with regard to those products. Well, Dick, I want to turn to you if I can. You told me, and it just stuck in my head when we had our first conversation, that you've been a director and a consultant to enterprises that have also been involved in IP litigation. And so I thought it might be interesting. Do you have any lessons learned that you can share with the audience in this area? Because I think there's a lot of cost potentially involved here, et cetera. And boy, I just think the scar tissue can be pretty valuable in this area.
Sure. If you think it's expensive to get a patent, get involved in patent litigation. And so I think the lesson that I've learned is to avoid it and to negotiate, if you can, some kind of settlement. The first classical example that I was peripherally involved in was the pillar point controversy over the excimer laser treatment of refractive errors, and there was a lawsuit between Vizx and Summit. An astronomical amount of money was spent on that lawsuit. In the end, in my opinion, both of the companies would have been much better off if they had just negotiated a settlement early on. It probably would have come out about the way it did after all the litigation. And in the end, you don't win in the marketplace with patents. In the end, you win in the marketplace when you commercialize and have a better and more successful product. And so I think sometimes keeping that in mind, that just having a patent, you can probably negotiate and cross-license and then just win in the marketplace and put the other company out of business by having a better product or better commercialization. I mean, sometimes you have to fight the battle, and again, using a more recent one, perhaps the Glaukos Transcend litigation is an example where you maybe have to fight the battle, otherwise you might not be able to raise the money that you need to commercialize. But my experience is it's usually best to settle. And to put my money where my mouth is, early on in my career, I developed some patents in technology and corneal preservation. There was another well-known inventor that had the same, and basically what we did is we just negotiated, let's do it together. And I think that ended up being probably a very good decision.
That's a great comment. Mark?
Maybe it's something about lasers, Dick. If you go back to the invention of the laser and the two people that got the Nobel Prize, it was Townes and Shallow, and they were involved in a 30-year patent dispute from around the late 1950s until it was settled in 1987. I think everybody was dead by then, or nearly dead by then, and so I'm not sure who was benefited by it, but it took that long. And it's in keeping with that old saying that success has many fathers and failures an orphan. And of course, when you have a successful technology, it may be years later when everyone goes, "Hey, I invented that in the shower. I remember." And so anyway, it's I'm kidding a little bit about lasers, but it seems to have really been quite a thing for many years.
Any other comments? No. So thank you very much, panelists, for your thoughts, and we'll move on to the next bit of our business.